In the mid-1990s, the city felt exhausted, not destroyed, just worn down. During the day, life continued out of habit. Markets were open, public transport still ran. People hurried along the streets, focused on their own concerns. But in the evenings, everything changed. After 9 p.m., the streets emptied quickly. Streetlights didn't work everywhere. Some gave off a weak yellow glow. Others were completely dark. In residential districts, the shadows of panel buildings filled the courtyards, and in those shadows, unfamiliar figures often lingered. Ground floor apartments were considered inconvenient, but affordable. They were usually taken by people who had no better option. Few windows had bars. Intercom systems were rare. Doors were simple, with basic locks. Winter made the city even quieter. Snow softened footsteps. The cold drove people indoors. In the evenings, every sound stood out. A door slamming, steps in a stairwell, a doorbell ringing. Apartment entrances smelled of damp concrete and old paint. Light bulbs were often missing. Elevators were unreliable. When they worked at all, police units were overstretched. The same patrols covered multiple districts. Routine calls were handled quickly. If there were no obvious signs of violence, cases were often closed as soon as possible. It was in this atmosphere that what later became known as an ordinary case began. One of many, easy to lose among dozens of others. If not for what happened next. The first victim was Elena Kravtsova. She was 38 years old, divorced. No children. She worked as a merchandise clerk for a small private company in the city center. The job was quiet. No late shifts. No business trips. Payments were irregular, but steady. By the standards of that time, it was considered stable. Elena lived alone. Her ground floor apartment was assigned to her after the divorce. The building was old, a typical panel block, with windows facing the courtyard. There were no bars on the windows. Elena believed the area was safe. Neighbors described her the same way: quiet, polite. She returned home at roughly the same time every evening. She greeted people, but never lingered in the stairwell. She avoided unnecessary conversations. On the evening of November 14th, she left work later than usual. She stopped at a small shop near the tram stop. Bread and milk. The receipt was later found on the kitchen table. She returned home around 8:30 p.m. The second victim was Natalia Selezneva. She was 42, a nurse, a widow. She lived alone in a one-room apartment, also on the ground floor, just a few blocks away from Kravtsova's building. The same type of neighborhood. Poor lighting, no intercom systems. Natalia worked at a local clinic. She often took night shifts, but that day she stayed home. According to a neighbor, she complained about the cold in her apartment and about her front door. It didn't close properly. Around 10 p.m., someone rang her doorbell. The neighbor heard a male voice in the stairwell. She couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, the lights in the apartment went out. The two women did not know each other. They had no shared friends, no shared workplace, no shared routines. The only things they had in common were the ground floor and living alone. When investigators later reconstructed their final hours, one more detail emerged. Both women had been drinking tea shortly before their deaths. Cups were found on the kitchen tables. A thin residue remained at the bottom. The liquid was no longer hot, but not completely cold. There were no signs of struggle. Furniture was undisturbed. Neighbors reported no screams. Whoever came to their doors that evening, they opened the door themselves. When Elena Kravtsova's body was discovered, the case initially looked routine. An early morning call, a stairwell with neighbors standing nearby, a few brief instructions. the smell of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. The report did not come immediately. At first, her co-workers raised concerns. She hadn't shown up for work. Her phone went unanswered. Colleagues tried to reach her through neighbors. Only the next day, when it became clear this was not a simple absence, the police were called. The apartment was opened carefully, without damaging the door frame. At that stage, there was still a possibility that the woman inside had simply lost consciousness. Inside, the apartment appeared lived in. Shoes stood by the door. A coat hung on the hook. A handbag lay in the hallway. On the kitchen table, a cup and a kettle. There were no signs of forced entry. That fact alone pushed the investigation in a familiar direction. If the door wasn't broken, then she must have opened it herself, which meant she likely knew the person who came inside. From the very beginning, the case began drifting toward a domestic explanation. The inspection followed standard procedure. The layout of the apartment, furniture placement, doors, windows, light switches. But this is where the first weaknesses appeared. The stairwell was never properly secured. Neighbors moved freely through it. Someone walked past the investigators and went upstairs. At the time, stairwells were rarely treated as part of the crime scene. The front door and lock were inspected, but the lock cylinder was not removed immediately for analysis. That was done later, after the scene had already been compromised. The windows faced the courtyard. There were no bars. Fresh snow lay beneath the windows. Possible footprints could have been there, but by the time anyone thought to look, the yard had already come back to life. Residents passed through. Children walked across it. A janitor cleared snow. Whatever traces may have existed were gone. The body was found in the bedroom. Cause of death: strangulation. The mark on the neck was clear. It was not consistent with a fall or an accident. It was the result of deliberate pressure. Still, the early reports used cautious language. Presumed, possible, signs of compression. Calling it a homicide outright meant additional oversight, paperwork, and scrutiny. And at that moment, there was no suspect. In the minds of the investigators, one explanation took hold quickly. A familiar person, a private conflict, an argument that went too far. Neighbors were questioned briefly. Did anyone hear shouting? Did anyone see strangers? Anything unusual? In apartment buildings like this, doors slammed constantly. Footsteps echoed through stairwells day and night, but no one recalled screams. Some residents mentioned vague details. A man standing near the entrance, someone smoking in the courtyard, lights turning off earlier than usual. None of it sounded certain, and uncertain details rarely survive in official reports. Investigators moved through the standard checklist. The ex-husband was located and questioned. His alibi was confirmed. Co-workers were interviewed. No conflicts, no threats, no known disputes. Neighbors were rechecked. Nothing concrete. On paper, the case looked complete. In reality, it was stalled. The most important area was never properly reconstructed. The victim's route home, the tram stop, the nearby shop, the path through the courtyard, the entrance to the building. Witnesses might have been there. Someone might have noticed a man watching the entrance. Someone might have remembered a conversation. But that kind of work takes time, and time was scarce. In the mid-1990s, investigators handled dozens of cases simultaneously. Each new incident pushed older ones further down the list. If a witness didn't come forward immediately, they were often lost forever. Fingerprints were collected, surfaces were tested, objects were seized for examination. But many surfaces had already been touched by co-workers, neighbors, first responders, officers. Most fingerprints belonged to the victim or to people who had been there earlier. Any unfamiliar print could easily be explained away. Expert reports took weeks. And without a suspect, the case began to lose momentum. After several days, investigators had a familiar result. No signs of forced entry, no clear motive, no suspect, no direct witnesses. Without public attention or pressure, the case quietly slipped into the backlog. It became one of many. The investigation locked itself into a single assumption too early, that the victim had let in someone she knew. Anything that didn't fit that idea was treated as background noise. But even then, there were troubling signs. No theft, no personal conflict, a controlled, silent method of killing. This was not an impulsive act. It suggested preparation. Ground floor apartments were vulnerable, especially in the evenings. At that time, it was common for strangers to knock on doors under simple pretexts: utility inspections, plumbing issues, electrical problems. People open their doors. That possibility was never fully pursued. And because of that, the first murder remained unresolved until the second one occurred. The second murder happened a little over a month later. At first, it looked like another routine call, one that could have easily disappeared into daily reports. If not for the details, the report came in early in the morning. A woman had not shown up for work. Her phone was silent. No one answered the door. The address was in the same residential district. A ground floor apartment, windows facing the courtyard. For experienced investigators, the similarity was already troubling. The apartment was opened using the same careful method. Once again, there was no visible damage to the door inside. Everything appeared orderly. Personal belongings were untouched. No signs of a search. No missing valuables. On the kitchen table stood a cup. A spoon lay in the sink. A kettle remained on the stove. The body was found in the room. Cause of death: strangulation. The method was nearly identical to the first case. Manual pressure to the neck. No weapon. No excessive injuries. There were no signs of a struggle. The apartment did not look disturbed. This was no longer coincidence. There was, however, one new detail. Near the front door, investigators found traces of dirt on the floor. Not clear footprints, more like smudges, as if someone had been standing there, shifting their weight, waiting. This time, the stairwell was sealed immediately. For the first time, the entrance was treated as part of the crime scene. The investigation took on a different tone. The same investigator requested the files from Eleanor Kravtsova's case. Side by side, the similarities were impossible to ignore. 2 women, living alone, ground floor apartments, evening hours, no theft, no forced entry, the same method of killing. The earlier domestic explanation was no longer convincing. This time, neighbors were questioned more thoroughly, and some details finally stayed consistent. Several residents mentioned a man they had seen near the building in the days before the murder. He did not live there. No one recognized him. He stood near the entrance, smoked, watched the windows. In the past, such figures blended into the background. In the 1990s, courtyards were rarely empty. Now, the detail mattered. Descriptions varied, but the core remained the same. A man in his early 30s, dark jacket, calm manner of speech. Some heard him mention plumbing issues. Others recalled him asking about electrical problems. He sounded official enough, and people listened. After the second murder, the Kravtsova file was reopened. What had once seemed insignificant now stood out clearly. No motive, no emotional connection, No escalation of violence. The pattern suggested something else. For the first time, the case files included a new phrase, possible serial offenses. * The investigation moved beyond acquaintances. Officers began checking previously convicted offenders, unemployed men without stable residence, individuals offering door-to-door services, people known for moving between buildings and districts. They visited housing offices, markets, scrapyards. They asked about men who worked the stairwells. And that was when a name surfaced. Quietly, almost in passing. It wasn't treated as important at first. A man without permanent registration. Occasional repair work. Known to disappear for weeks. He had been questioned before. For minor issues. Nothing serious. But this time, his name was written down separately. If there had been only one murder, it might have been forgotten. If there had been only two, they might have been dismissed as unrelated. But to nearly identical crimes, in the same district, within weeks, that was no longer chance. From that moment on, the investigation stopped being procedural. It became a search for someone who moved freely between buildings, someone who waited for doors to open. It became a hunt. The name did not surface immediately, and it did not come from a database. It was mentioned casually, the way dozens of names are mentioned when a district is reviewed. Alexei Martinov, 32 years old. People described him briefly. He walks stairwells, does small repair jobs, appears, then disappears. In the mid-1990s, that description fit many. Officially, Martinov was unemployed. He had no permanent registration. He lived wherever he could arrange a temporary place, rented rooms, shared apartments, short-term stays. He had one prior conviction, petty theft, no violence, a suspended sentence, nothing that would immediately place him above others like him. In practice, Martinov lived between courtyards, markets, and stairwells. He spoke calmly, never rushed, never raised his voice. That mattered. People opened their doors to him. Because he did not look threatening. He did not look unstable. He did not look like someone from the street. Later, neighbors would describe him the same way. Ordinary, nothing unusual. There were many like him. And that was exactly why he blended in. He had been around the area for months. Sometimes a week before a crime. Sometimes longer. He did not act every day. He waited. He listened to conversations in stairwells. About cold apartments. About leaking pipes. About faulty wiring. He observed. It was not a hunt in the usual sense. It was patience. Martinov did not break doors. He did not pick locks. He waited for the door to be opened. The pretexts were simple and familiar. A utility inspection. There's a leak upstairs. Electrical work. At that time, such visits were common. People rarely asked for identification. Especially in the evening. Ground floor apartments gave him control. If something went wrong, he could leave quickly, disappear into the courtyard, enter another building, be gone within minutes. No elevators, no long stairwells. Everything was close. Once investigators focused on him, details began to align. Someone had seen him near a building days before the murder. Someone else had noticed him standing in a courtyard, smoking, watching windows. Another recalled seeing him leave quickly late in the evening. Before, these moments meant nothing. Now, they formed a pattern. He was invited in for a conversation, not detained. No pressure. He arrived calmly, answered confidently. Only the dates troubled him. When asked where he had been on specific evenings, his answers shifted. First he said he stayed with a friend, then that he was alone. Then that he could not remember at all. Experienced investigators noticed immediately People with solid alibis remember details. People who lie hesitate. Asterisk a brief search revealed nothing overtly criminal, but several items were noted. A set of keys, unlabeled, a woman's belt among his belongings, a notebook with addresses and stairwell notes. He explained everything as work-related. Keys from jobs, addresses of clients. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it didn't. Asterisk he was not arrested immediately. Instead, he was watched. And that was when investigators felt they were close. Martinov changed his behavior, stopped appearing in familiar courtyards, changed where he slept, became cautious. It was the behavior of someone who knew attention had found him. Asterisk the decision to detain him was not rushed. Investigators waited for expert reports, compared witness statements, checked addresses from the notebook. Several matched the districts of the crimes. At that point, there were no doubts. He was detained early in the morning, without resistance. When asked why, he answered calmly, "I expected you would come." Asterisk Martinov was brought to the station early in the morning. No handcuffs, no urgency. That approach was deliberate. When investigators want a person to talk, they avoid pressure at first. He appeared calm, almost unnaturally calm for someone taken in without explanation. Asterisk the first questioning was routine. Where he had been on certain dates, what he had been doing, where he had spent the night. Martinov answered evenly. No anger, no visible anxiety. He said he walked stairwells, looked for work, moved around the city. It was a convenient answer. To convenient. Asterisk the investigator did not argue, did not raise his voice. Instead, the same questions were asked again, later, in a different order, with slightly different wording. Where were you on the evening of November 14th? What about the next night? Try to recall the hours. That was when Martinov began to hesitate. At first, he said he stayed with an acquaintance. Then he said he had been alone. Later, he claimed he could not remember at all. For an experienced investigator, that mattered. People with solid alibis remember details. People who fabricate answers lose consistency. Asterisk during the second interrogation, photographs were placed on the table. Not crime scene images, not bodies, photographs of stairwells, courtyards, entrances, the same buildings witnesses had described. Martinov studied them too closely. A fraction of a second longer than necessary. Asterisk between interrogations. He was left alone. 4 hours. Sometimes without light. It was not overt pressure. It was waiting. A person begins to replay conversations, to wonder what investigators already know, to think about mistakes. By the evening of the second day, Martinov spoke less. His answers became short. He avoided eye contact. Asterisk the confrontation changed everything. A neighbor from the second victim's building sat across from him. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I saw him," she said. He was standing near the entrance. Martinov did not object, did not interrupt. He lowered his head. Asterisk that night, he barely slept. It showed in the morning. His hands trembled. His voice was quieter. The investigator asked one question. "Do you understand that this is no longer one case?" Martinov nodded. Asterisk. He began to speak on his own, without detail, without emotion. He said he entered apartments under simple pretexts, that he chose ground floor units, that he acted alone. When asked why, he remained silent for a long time. Then he said, "It was easier that way." Asterisk the confession was not accepted immediately. Martinov was taken to the locations. He showed the entrances, where he stood, where he waited, which direction he left. He did not hesitate. He did not make mistakes. That was what unsettled the officers most. He knew too much. On the third day, he told everything. How he selected buildings, how he waited for doors to open, how he acted quickly and quietly. He did not describe violence. He spoke as if explaining a process. The investigation established 5 episodes. 2 were fully confirmed. 3 were admitted by Martinov without recovered victims. A psychological assessment followed. He was found legally sane, cold, methodical, without remorse. The conclusion stated, he understood the nature and consequences of his actions. Once the protocols were signed, Martinov asked a single question: will this take long? The investigator answered, honestly. Double quotes forever. Martinov nodded. He asked nothing else. The trial of Alexei Martinov began in the spring. There was no public attention, no cameras, no reporters. The hearings were closed almost immediately. The reason was stated formally: the nature of the crimes and the testimony involved. Martinov was brought in early, through a service entrance. He took his seat without resistance. He remained calm. No visible emotion, no reaction to the presence of the victim's relatives. When asked whether he admitted guilt, he answered briefly, I plead guilty in full. That answer defined the tone of the entire trial. The prosecutor read the indictment slowly and evenly. Each episode was presented separately. The date, the address, the method of entry, the cause of death. The courtroom remained silent when the victims' names were read aloud. One relative left the room. The prosecutor did not pause. Facts were allowed to speak for themselves. The court reviewed crime scene reports, forensic medical conclusions, witness statements, reconstructions conducted on site, the psychological evaluation of the defendant. Special attention was given to the similarities between the crimes, the same conditions, the same method, the same pattern. The court listened carefully. Witnesses were called one by one: neighbors, district officers, investigators. Their statements were unemotional. No dramatic language, no speculation. One witness, the neighbor who had seen Martinov near the entrance, all said, I can't say he looked dangerous, he looked ordinary. That sentence stayed in the room than the others. The defense did not dispute the facts. The attorney spoke of a difficult childhood, of social instability, of the chaos of the 1990s. The argument was not about innocence, it was about mitigation. The speech was brief. Throughout the hearings, Martinov remained composed. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. At times, he made notes on a sheet of paper provided to him. What he wrote was never disclosed. When the method of killing was described, he did not look away. The court granted him the right to a final statement. He stood. He did not apologize. He did not justify himself. He said, I understood what I was doing. I have nothing more to add. It lasted less than a minute. The court withdrew briefly. The decision had been clear long before the closing arguments. When the judge returned, the verdict was read in formal language: guilty on all counts. Sentence: capital punishment. No one reacted. Martinov listened calmly. He nodded once. The courtroom emptied quickly. No statements were given. The defense attorney left. The relatives were escorted out. Martinov was taken away through the same corridor. For the court, the case was concluded. After the verdict was delivered, the case entered an administrative phase. No further investigative actions were taken. The files were bound, sealed, and transferred for storage. Martinov was transported to a high-security detention facility. The date of execution was not disclosed, not to relatives, not to the defense. That was standard procedure. The waiting period lasted several months. During this time, formal appeals were reviewed, not the substance of the case, Only procedural compliance. No violations were found. The conclusions remained unchanged. He was fully aware of his actions. He acted deliberately. Several days before the sentence was carried out, Martinov was informed that his request for clemency had been denied. The document was brief. No explanation was provided. He listened calmly. He signed without comment. When asked if he had a final statement, he replied, "There is nothing to say." The sentence was carried out in the spring of 1996. The procedure lasted only a few minutes. Official records include only the date, the time, the signatures of responsible officials. No further details. Relatives were informed after the fact. The body was not released. The burial location was not disclosed. The defense attorney received a formal notice confirming the execution. That marked the end of his involvement. Following the execution, the case was officially closed. The files were archived. The registration log received a final entry. Sentence carried out. Nothing more. After the sentence was carried out, the city did not change. There were no announcements, no public statements, no official explanations. For most residents, the case remained unknown. Elena Kravtsova's apartment was sold a few months later. No references, no disclosures. The new owners made cosmetic repairs. They replaced the wallpaper. They changed the door. At first, neighbors paid attention. Then they stopped. Natalia Selesneva's apartment changed owners later. There were repeated complaints about dampness and plumbing problems. The pipes were replaced twice. No one connected it to what had happened before. Life in the courtyards continued as usual. Children played. Trams ran on schedule. Entrances grew dark in the evenings, just as they always had. Intercom systems were installed years later. Bars on windows followed, not because of this case, simply because time moved on. Witnesses who had testified rarely spoke about that period afterward. Years later, when asked, they answered briefly, "It was a long time ago. I don't remember. There was a lot going on back then." For the victims' families, this was never a case. It was a life that had ended. The investigator who brought the case to court later said, "This was not the most complex investigation of his career. The hardest part was realizing that the first murder could have been solved sooner, if the scope had been broader, if early assumptions had not narrowed the search. But in the 1990s, this was common practice." The case files still exist. Several volumes, reports, expert conclusions, witness statements. No photographs on the cover. No explanations. Just another file among thousands. There was one detail rarely mentioned in official summaries. All the crimes occurred within walking distance. No vehicles, no complex routes. He chose places where he could disappear within minutes. And he did, until he didn't. For the system, the case was closed. For statistics, it was resolved. For the city, it was forgotten. And that is why stories like this are rarely remembered. There is no mystery, no spectacle, no famous names, only people, stairwells, and doors that were opened once.